It was February 14, 1990, Valentine's Day, and the United Center had not yet been built. The Chicago Bulls still played at Chicago Stadium, the old barn on West Madison Street, a building so loud on its best nights that visiting players described the noise as a physical thing, something you could feel pressing against your eardrums before you even stepped through the tunnel. But on this night, in the hour before tip-off, the arena was still mostly quiet. The cleaning crew had finished their last pass down the lower bowl. The floor, freshly polished, caught the arena lights and threw them back in long, amber streaks. The temperature inside was 58 degrees at court level, cold enough that the players' breath still fogged slightly during warm-ups before the heat of bodies and lights pushed the air toward something livable. Outside, Chicago was experiencing one of the coldest February nights in years, a wind chill that pushed the real feel below zero, the kind of cold that made the city feel stripped down to its bones. People had come anyway. The stadium was sold out, as it almost always was, when Michael Jordan was in the building, and the last of the crowd was filing in through the upper concourses, stamping warmth back into their feet, shaking snow from their coats. The visiting locker room sat at the end of a narrow corridor beneath the stands, and what happened there in the 30 minutes before the game would not be recorded by any official source. No camera crew was present. No beat reporter had access. But the men who were in that room would carry the memory of it for the rest of their careers, and in the years that followed, the story would surface in fragments, in interviews, in the kind of candid conversations athletes have when the competitive stakes have finally softened enough to allow honesty. The Cleveland Cavaliers were in that locker room, and they were laughing. The laughter was not random. It had a specific target. Someone had obtained a copy of a practice tape or claimed to have seen one, the details varying slightly depending on who told the story later, and the tape showed Michael Jordan working on a post move that had gone badly. Not badly in the ordinary athletic sense, the way a layup clips the bottom of the rim and clangs away, badly in the other sense. The move had failed. Jordan had lost his footing on the second step and gone down to one knee, and someone in that locker room had found a way to share the image, or the description of it, with enough comedic timing that the room had dissolved into the particular kind of laughter that athletes understand as a release valve for the tension of facing someone they feared. Because the Cavaliers did fear Michael Jordan. They feared him the way you fear something inevitable. And sometimes when you cannot escape what frightens you, you laugh at it instead. Craig Ehlo was in that locker room. He was 28 years old and playing the best basketball of his life. The previous spring, Jordan had ended the Cavaliers' season with a shot that Cleveland fans would come to call simply the shot, a moment so complete in its devastation that it had its own grammar, its own capital letters, its own permanent residence in the collective wound of an entire city. Ehlo had been the man defending on that play. He had been in perfect position. He had done almost everything right. And Jordan had gone up over him anyway, hung in the air for what seemed to Ehlo like an impossible duration, and released the ball with a kind of calm that should not have been available to a human being in that moment. The Cavaliers had lost. The series had ended. The summer that followed was long. Ehlo had worked. That was the thing about him. He was not a player who accepted defeat as destiny. He had added strength to his lower body, refined his footwork, studied tape of Jordan with the obsessive focus of a man who needed to understand the thing that had humiliated him. He had come into the 1989-90 season with genuine conviction that he had found something, some adjustment in his defensive technique, some way of contesting Jordan's release that would change the equation between them. His teammates saw that confidence, and it was contagious. The Cavaliers were a good team. Mark Price was one of the premier point guards in the Eastern Conference, a shooter whose mechanics were so clean they looked like an illustration from a coaching manual. Larry Nance was a force at the fore, athletic and intelligent, a player who could guard multiple positions and score in traffic. Brad Daugherty, the center, was averaging over 20 points and nearly 10 rebounds. This was not a team that had come to Chicago simply to compete. They had come to win. And when one of the assistant coaches let slip what he claimed to have seen on that practice tape, the laughter in the room was not the laughter of men who were afraid. It was, or tried to be, the laughter of men who had identified a flaw. Jordan can't keep his footing on that new move, someone said. He's going to the post more this year, and he doesn't have it yet. He slips on the second step. Someone made a physical joke about it, demonstrating with exaggerated stumbling, and the room laughed again. Alo laughed. He would remember that he laughed. He would say so later, years later, when the memory had aged enough to carry a different weight. He would say that the laughter felt good and then immediately wrong, the way a meal tastes perfect right up until the moment it doesn't, and by then it is already too late. In the other locker room, Michael Jordan was taping his wrists. He did this himself always with a precision that his trainers had long since stopped offering to assist with. The tape went on in a specific sequence, a specific tension, and Jordan's hands moved through the process with the automatic confidence of a man performing a ritual. He had performed so many times, it had become something closer to meditation than preparation. Scottie Pippen was at the next locker, going through his own routine, and the two of them had the particular silence of men who had spent enough time together that conversation was no longer necessary to communicate. Horace Grant was lacing his shoes in the corner. Bill Cartwright was standing near the whiteboard where Phil Jackson had diagrammed the first 3 defensive sets they would run against Price. The room smelled of liniment and fresh tape, and the faint chemical smell of the floor wax that had drifted in from under the door. Jordan had heard about the tape. In an environment as porous as a professional basketball team's, information traveled in strange and rapid ways, and by the time the Cavaliers were laughing in their locker room, Jordan already knew the broad shape of what was being said. One of the assistant coaches had mentioned it, carefully in the way that people in Jordan's orbit learned to mention things they believed he needed to know, quickly, without editorializing, and then immediately leaving the room. Jordan had not responded. He had been in the middle of taping his wrist when the information arrived, and he had continued taping his wrist when it was finished being delivered, and the expression on his face had not changed in any way that the assistant coach could identify. But the quality of the silence in the room had changed. Pippen felt it. Grant felt it. Cartwright, who was old enough and wise enough to have developed an acute sensitivity to the atmospheric pressure around a man who was about to make someone pay for something, felt it and quietly moved 3 steps toward the exit. Jordan finished the tape. He flexed his hands twice, testing the tension. He stood up from the bench, and the movement was unhurried, economical, the movement of a man who had nowhere he needed to rush because everything that needed to happen would happen in the time he chose for it to happen. He looked at himself in the mirror above the sink for a moment, not with vanity, with assessment. The look that closes over his face in moments like this was something his teammates had seen before, and had no adequate language for. It was not anger exactly, though it contained heat. It was not focus exactly, though it contained clarity. It was the expression of a man who had taken an external fact, a slight, a laugh, a piece of tape shown around a visiting locker room, and filed it somewhere internal where it would be converted into something else entirely. He had a name for the feeling, though he rarely used it in public. He called it finding a reason. He was very good at finding reasons. Phil Jackson gave his pre-game remarks, and Jordan listened with the attentiveness of a student who already knew the material but respected the teacher enough to give him the full surface of his attention. When Jackson finished, Jordan said nothing. He picked up the ball from the floor, bounced it once, and walked toward the tunnel. The game began at 7:31, 2 minutes behind schedule because of a technical issue with the arena's shot clock display. The referees were Dick Bavetta, Jess Kersey, and Lee Jones. The atmosphere in the building was the usual Chicago Stadium atmosphere, which is to say it was extraordinary by any standard that exists outside of Chicago Stadium. The crowd of 18,000 and some hundreds was already operating at a volume that made normal conversation impossible on the floor. The introductions for the Bulls began, and the noise climbed another register, the old building's structure actually vibrating with it, the ancient girders and the decades of absorbed sound giving back something that newer arenas could not replicate. Jordan was introduced last, as always, and the sound that greeted him was the particular sound of 18,000 people who needed him to do something specific tonight, who had come through the cold and the wind and the 0-degree wind chill, because they believed that what they were about to witness would be worth every inconvenience. Jordan jogged onto the floor with his head slightly down, the way he almost always did, the gesture reading as either humility or the focused inward turning of a man who had already started the game in his mind several minutes ago. Alo watched him from across the lane. He was still feeling the residue of the locker room laughter. It had been good, that laughter. It had made the thing feel manageable. He told himself he was ready. The first quarter was, by Jordan's standards, controlled. He scored 11 points on 5 of 8 shooting, but more than the numbers, what defined his play in those first 12 minutes was the quality of his attention to Alo. He did not go at Alo early. He let Alo come to him, which is a different and more unsettling thing. Jordan would receive the ball on the wing, and Alo would set himself in his improved defensive stance, the one he had worked on through the summer, and Jordan would look at him with a patience that had no deadline in it. He scored his first basket with a pull-up jumper from the elbow, clean and quick but not spectacular. His second came on a drive where he absorbed contact from Alo's chest, finished with his right hand, and got the foul call. He bounced up from the floor after the contact without looking at Alo. The absence of acknowledgement was itself a statement, but Alo did not yet understand the grammar of it. The second quarter brought the first layer of what was coming. Mark Price, the Cavaliers' engine, had been controlling the pace beautifully, using ball screens to create angles and get into the lane, and his presence forced Chicago to make defensive adjustments that briefly disrupted the flow of what Jordan was trying to build. There was a sequence midway through the second quarter where Price scored on consecutive possessions, a floater and a pull-up 15-footer, and the Cavaliers' bench reacted with the kind of animated positivity that sometimes precedes a very bad experience. One of the assistant coaches, the same one who had contributed to the locker room moment before the game, made a remark toward the floor that was not audible to Jordan, but was close enough to the sideline that Jordan registered the tone of it, the brightness of it, and filed it. Jordan scored 22 in the first half on 50% shooting. The Cavaliers led by 3 at intermission, 51-48, and in their locker room, the mood was genuinely good. Alo had given up only the 11 first-quarter points and felt that his positioning was working, that the adjustments he'd made were real, that what had happened last spring was correctable. Price was efficient and composed. Doherty was controlling the paint. The game was going according to their plan, and the laughter from before tip-off had been replaced by something quieter and more serious and more dangerous, which was belief. In the Bulls' locker room, Phil Jackson said very few words. He looked at Jordan. Jordan looked at his hands for a moment, the taped wrists, the way he always looked at his hands when he was organizing something internal. Then he looked up. "Second half," he said. And that was all he said. And it was enough because everyone in the room understood that what he meant was not a reference to the game's remaining time. What he meant was that the thing they had all felt building in the first half, the controlled pressure, the patience, the predator's deliberate circling, was about to change its nature. The second half was not going to be a continuation. It was going to be a different conversation. The third quarter opened with Jordan posting up on the left block against Alo, and here was the thing that the locker room tape had apparently captured and apparently documented as a flaw. Jordan on the low post, working a specific counter move that involved a jab step right, a pivot back left, and a turnaround jumper over the left shoulder. The move that had not worked in practice. The move that had sent him to one knee. Alo positioned himself with the improved technique, slightly off his man, anticipating the footwork, ready for the moment when Jordan would lose his balance on the second step and the opportunity would present itself. Jordan jabbed right. Alo adjusted. Jordan pivoted left, and here was the interesting thing, the thing that the practice tape had not shown, because the practice tape was from 6 weeks ago, and Jordan had spent 6 weeks on that specific problem. The thing was that the second step was no longer uncertain. He had fixed it. He had gone into the gym before morning shoot-around and after evening practice, and sometimes at 11 at night, with a trainer who had agreed to be there, because when Jordan needed the gym at 11 at night, the trainer came to the gym at 11 at night, and he had taken that second step 500 times or 1,000 times, until it was no longer the step that sent him to one knee, but was instead the step that created the exact angle he needed. The turnaround came up over Alo's outstretched right hand. The arc was perfect, and the ball split the net without touching the rim. Alo stood at the free throw line and breathed. The Cavaliers called a timeout, and the crowd in Chicago Stadium reacted to the basket and to what it implied with the full register of their awareness. These were basketball fans in the truest sense, people who understood not just the score, but the grammar of momentum. And they felt in that moment what Alo was beginning to feel, which was the opening of something that could not now be closed. Jordan scored 8 consecutive points over the next 4.5 minutes. He scored them in 4 different ways: a mid-range jumper off the dribble from the right elbow, a drive left where he changed hands in the air and finished against Nance, who had rotated over from the strong side and was playing the correct defensive position, and was beaten anyway, not by athleticism alone, but by a decision made at a speed that made Nance's correct positioning irrelevant. A free throw pair after drawing contact from Doherty on a post-up. And then the basket that the game would eventually be remembered for, at least in the interior records of the people who were in the building that night. Jordan caught the ball at the top of the key with 21 seconds left on the shot clock, and Alo between him and the basket. Alo was playing well. He was in the right position. His hands were active, his feet were set, his distance from Jordan was calibrated to challenge the three without inviting the drive. Jordan took 1 dribble left, 1 dribble right, and then did something that exists in the gap between the describable and the merely witnessed. He stopped. Fully stopped. The dribble ended, and he was a standing man with the ball on his hip. And Alo, trained to react to movement, to reads, to the beginning of plays, had no reaction available to him because there was no movement to react to. There was only Michael Jordan standing still, looking at him with that expression, the closed one, the one that his teammates learned to fear. The moment lasted 8 seconds. The shot clock ticked. The crowd, sensing something, lowered its register slightly, the way large groups of people sometimes go quiet when the thing they've come to see is about to happen. Alo did not move. He could not move. Any move he made would create the opening. He stood in the stillness and felt what it meant to be the man Jordan was looking at, which was something beyond a basketball problem. It was a communication. It was Jordan saying without words, with only the quality of his attention, "I know you laughed, I know the locker room, I know what you think you saw on that tape, and now you are going to stand here and wait while I show you what I've done with the information that you laughed at me." 8 seconds passed. Jordan elevated in a jump that appeared unhurried, appeared to operate outside the constraint that gravity was supposed to impose on human bodies. His elbow was in, his wrist followed through, his eyes were on the back of the rim in the specific way that great shooters' eyes are on the back of the rim, not the general area of the basket, but the specific inch of orange iron that the ball's arc would need to clear. Alo's hand was there. It was genuinely close. A properly contested shot. And it went through cleanly, the net moving in that particular way that signals a ball that has touched nothing but itself, and the interior of the hoop. The arena found its maximum volume, not for the basket alone, but for what it meant, for the narrative it completed, for the clarity with which it had just demonstrated something about the relationship between humiliation and purpose, that the crowd understood, even if they would never articulate it in those terms. Alo did not turn to watch the celebration. He stood with his hands briefly on his knees, his eyes on the floor, and there was a moment, brief but real, when the posture was not athletic, but human in a more fundamental way. He was a man who had built a story over the course of a summer and a season, and a locker room laugh, and that story was concluding in a way he had not written. The story had been, "I can stop him. I have fixed the thing that failed. I have found the adjustment." The story was being rewritten in real time, not with violence, not with cruelty, but with the kind of elegant correction that is more final than cruelty, because it leaves no one to blame but the story itself. Jordan, for his part, had already turned. He was moving back toward the defensive end before the net had finished moving. There was no look at Alo, no gesture toward the bench, no acknowledgement of the crowd's reaction beyond the slight raising of his chin that might have been nothing and might have been everything. He was already somewhere else in his mind, already looking at the next 48 feet of floor, the next possession, the next thing. The moment that had just occurred was, for Jordan, already in the past, and the past was not where he lived. The fourth quarter finished in a way that the statistics record, but that the statistics cannot adequately describe. Jordan scored 36 in the second half, ending at 69 points for the game on 53% shooting. The Bulls won 117-93. Alo finished with 14 points, 4 assists, and played competent professional basketball for most of the evening, which under most circumstances would be considered a success. It was not, under the circumstances of that evening, considered a success. In the Cavaliers' locker room after the final buzzer, the silence was of a specific quality. Not the silence of shock exactly, because everyone in the building had felt what was happening as it was happening, and shock requires a gap between expectation and reality that had not existed in this case. What the silence held was something closer to the recognition that the game's outcome had been, in some sense, decided before the opening tip, decided in a corridor under the stands where someone had found a piece of tape and made a joke of it, and that the long sequence of events from that moment to this one had simply been the working out of a consequence. Halo showered and dressed without speaking. He had the look of a man running calculations, going over the sequence, searching for the specific error he could correct, the specific adjustment that would make the result different next time. The process was familiar to him. It was how he had processed the spring before. He was good at it. He believed in it. And somewhere in the later hours of that February night, after the bus ride and the team meal and the long flight home to Cleveland, the calculations would yield to something else, something less comfortable than a solvable problem, which was the recognition that some opponents did not operate within the system of adjustments you could make, that some opponents took whatever adjustment you brought them and converted it into new information that improved their own operation. That Craig Alo would spend the rest of his career being an excellent defensive player and a genuinely skilled NBA professional, and that none of this would change the fact that when Michael Jordan needed a reason and Craig Alo was the available reason, the result was going to be that story and not the other story every time without variance. The coach who had mentioned the tape did not mention tape again that season. In the Bulls training room, Jordan's wrists were being unwrapped. The tape came off in the reverse of how it had gone on, with the same precision, the same specific sequence. Jordan sat on the table and let the trainer work, and he was already somewhere else. Already thinking, the people who knew him well understood, about the next game, the next opponent, the next man who might say something in a locker room or print something in a newspaper or make a face on the court that Jordan could convert into the particular fuel he ran on. He had an extraordinary engine and he kept it burning with a kind of deliberate attention to every slight, every doubt, every laugh in every corridor he could not see into, but somehow always managed to hear about. Phil Jackson would write about this quality in the years that followed, when he had the distance and language to describe it properly. He wrote about the controlled fire of it, about the way Jordan's competitive desire was not a raw thing, but a refined thing, not a reaction, but a method. He wrote about the paradox of a man who could access fury without being consumed by it, who could let the heat in without letting it burn down the structure of his intelligence. Jackson had seen many great competitors. He had never seen anyone who had turned the practice of motivation into a discipline the way Jordan had. Other players wanted to win. Jordan had built a system for converting every available input, every slight, every laugh, every tape passed around in a visiting locker room, into output on the floor. This was not natural talent, or it was not only natural talent, it was a practice. It was something Jordan had decided, at some point early in his career, to make into a practice, the deliberate cultivation of grievance as fuel, the careful storage of every humiliation for deployment at the exact moment it would do the most good. He had been cut from his high school varsity team as a sophomore and spent a year proving that the decision was wrong. He had been told at North Carolina that he was not yet ready to start as a freshman, and spent a season becoming the man who hit the championship shot. He had been told, in ways explicit and implied, throughout his early career, that he was a scorer, but not a winner, that the team would never advance past the second round with his game, and each of these criticisms had been folded into the file of available reasons. The Bulls won 3 consecutive championships between 1991 and 1993 on the back of the person those criticisms had helped make. The scar tissue was real. The diamond metaphor was accurate. There is a kind of pressure that destroys, and a kind of pressure that compresses, and the difference is not in the pressure itself but in the material it is applied to. Jordan had made himself through intention and repetition, and the willingness to sit with the discomfort of being underestimated, into a material that converted pressure into something harder and more useful. The locker room laugh was not a small thing to him. It was a gift. He knew how to receive that kind of gift, which is to say he knew how to defer the receipt of it until the moment when it could be spent most efficiently. 8 seconds standing still, the shot clock counting down, Elo's hand in his face, the crowd holding its breath. In those 8 seconds was contained the entire career's worth of received slights and converted grievances, every laugh in every corridor, every cut from every roster, every journalist who had questioned his championship credentials, every opponent who had said in public or private that they had found the adjustment. It came out in 8 seconds of absolute stillness, and then one jump and one release. It always came out like that for Jordan. Not in an explosion, in a precision, in the cold and deliberate execution of a plan that had been forming since the moment someone decided to laugh. Elo would play 8 more seasons in the NBA after that night, bouncing between teams, taking on the role of the veteran who contributed what he could. He was never a star and never claimed to be one. He was good, genuinely good at the game, and his career was by any honest measure a successful one. He made a living in the sport he loved, earned the respect of coaches and teammates and opponents who understood what it meant to compete at that level. None of this is diminished by the nights when Jordan found a reason and Elo was the reason. The diminishment, if it exists, is only in the comparison, and the comparison is unfair because it is a comparison to something that existed outside the normal distribution of greatness. He carried the night. This is true, and he has said so. Not as an open wound, but as a marker, a reference point for what excellence looked like when you were standing directly in front of it. He said in an interview many years later that knowing what it felt like to be on the wrong end of Jordan's focused attention was one of the more clarifying experiences of his life. That it told him something about the ceiling of human competitive excellence that no amount of studying tape or practicing adjustments could have taught him without the lived experience of the 8 seconds. He could respect it from the distance. He had found a way to take what had been a loss and make it into information, which is not the Jordan method, but is perhaps the human method, the less efficient and more forgiving version of the same conversion. Outside the arena, Chicago was still cold. The streets between the stadium and Lakeshore Drive largely empty now that the crowd had dispersed. The buses moved. The planes departed. The tape went into the archives. Jordan went to sleep that night without thinking about what had happened. Because what had happened was already in the past, and he was already in the future, already at the next game, the next city, the next man who might supply a reason. The lesson is not that winning is everything. The lesson is that what you do with the thing meant to diminish you determines everything. You are always being watched. The question is only whether the person watching is you.